All right, so for this meeting, we're going to cover social structure, specifically groups, organizations, and institutions. Last time we were talking about the social self, and we were talking about how we were going to sort of nest the social self in an increasingly larger set of structures as we move from the individual out toward the society as a whole. Uh, this is the complete nested hierarchical model of social structure and processes. Again, this is described in the chapter. You can find a handout with this diagram as well, and there's a blank version of it in the outline for you to kind of fill in on your own as you follow the lectures. Back at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that there are sort of two sources or two forces that shape how societies are organized. The first is going to be social structure, and the other is going to be culture. Now, we've spent some time talking about culture. We're now kind of in the part of the semester where we're discussing structure, and we want to spend a little bit of time on how sociology makes sense of things structurally. So let's start with the next largest structure. So when we move from the individual out toward increasingly larger structures, the first thing we encounter are what we call groups. Now, groups have to consist of at least two people, but obviously can be much larger than that. There's a German sociologist named George Simmel, who back in the early 1900s suggested that there were some very interesting kind of dynamics that happened with groups that were a function of just the size of the group, right? Not specific to or attached in any way to the people who make up those groups. So, for example, when he would look at a group of two people, what he called a dyad, he saw that there were certain kinds of constraints and certain kinds of limitations on the actors that made up that group that were different from the sorts of dynamics that occur when you have a triad. If you have a dyad and there's a conversation about where, for example, to go to lunch, let's say, and you and your friend want to go out for lunch, if you want to remain a group, you have to come to some agreement about where you're going to eat lunch. If you want to go to Jimmy John's and they want to go to Jason's, then one or the other is going to have to compromise or be persuaded, or a third option is going to have to be considered, which satisfies both parties. Because if you can't come to an agreement, right, you're free to go to one place for lunch and your friend is free to go to another place, but at that point you cease to be a group. If, on the other hand, you have a triad, you can take a vote, and two people can decide to go to one place, and even if the third person disagrees and goes off on their own, you're still a group, right? You've gone from a triad to a dyad, but nevertheless, you're still a group. That is a function of group size. It has nothing to do with the people who make up the group. It is entirely a function of the structural nature of the group. This is why, for example, we have 9 Supreme Court justices. We could have more than 9, we could have fewer than 9, but it's always going to be important that it be an odd number to prevent ties, right? If you're a court of last appeal, it's very important that you be able to definitively arrive at a decision. So if the Supreme Court were composed of 8 people, you could have a 4-4 split, and a decision could not be rendered, right? So whenever you have judicial bodies like that, they are always odd number bodies. It doesn't have to be, as I said, it doesn't have to be 9. It could be 11. It could be 13. It could be 3, right? But it always will have to be an odd number. So that's kind of, again, a function of the group. So when we think about groups structurally, well, let's talk about what we mean by a group before we talk about it structurally. So definitionally, a group is a set of people who interact fairly regularly with one another and who are conscious of their identity as a group. Right? That's the definition that you find in the text. It's the definition you find in the outline. Structurally speaking, I want you to think of the group as a set of relationally defined statuses. Now, this is a really important distinction that I want to make here. A self is also a collection of statuses. but the statuses are not relationally defined, right? I can be both a student and a teacher, but I am never my own teacher, right? So as an individual person, I could be teaching college classes, but I could also be taking courses in some content area. So at some points in my day, I might be a teacher. At other points in my day, I might be a student. So I can be a teacher and a student, but I am never my own teacher. I am never my own student. So that's the difference between the selves, or I'm sorry, the statuses that make up a self and the statuses that make up a group. The statuses that make up a group are defined in relation to the other statuses within the group. So if we look, for example, at Sociology 101, right, we see that there's a teacher and there are students. Right? Those are relationally defined statuses. That's what makes the group a group. Groups can be largely divided into two categories, formal groups and informal groups. A formal group is characterized mostly by instrumental ties. So this class is what we would consider to be a formal group. We interact more or less regularly with each other. We're conscious of our identity as a group, but the relations that exist between the statuses in this class are instrumental, right? You're not here because you like me. I'm not here because I like you. We're not precluded from liking one another. I want to be really clear about that. You guys are free to like me. I am free to like you. But liking one another or not isn't particularly relevant to the operation of the group, right? You're here to get knowledge and to have that knowledge assessed so that it can become part of a credential. I'm here to get a paycheck, right? And so we're here kind of pursuing our interests. But we do, in the pursuit of those interests, end up creating and maintaining a group. An informal group is characterized by what we call affective ties. These are emotional bonds. So this would be things like your family or your friends. We often call friends and communities of friends, we often call them affinity groups. That is because the people in those groups have some emotional connections to one another. So you can see there's a lot that kind of goes on at this level that becomes a little bit more sophisticated in many ways than just looking at an individual self. There's quite a bit going on here. Now, I mentioned families. I'm going to use that very quickly as a way to illustrate how a sociologist would look at a structure like a family and how it's a little bit different than maybe the way that we kind of become accustomed to looking at families. If you were asked to diagram your family, you might create what we call a family tree. That's a fairly conventional exercise in which you'd put maybe your parents, and then you'd have sort of a line coming down from them to you if you're an only child, or maybe multiple lines descending to you and your siblings if you have brothers and sisters. So I'm going to use my favorite go-to group. I'm going to use the Simpsons. And we've got Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie. And I hope that the Simpsons are familiar enough to most people that the the relations are fairly well established. But if you don't know this cartoon family at all, right? Homer and Marge are a married couple, and they have three kids: Bart, who's the oldest, Lisa, and then Maggie, the little baby. When this show came out, I'll just make a side note about sort of the cultural significance of the Simpsons. When The Simpsons came out back in the late 1980s, and I know that show has been around forever. It's still on the air. I can't believe that sometimes. And I say that as a fan. I'm like, this is maybe time to pack it in. But anyway, the show came out. It was actually kind of making fun of the way that pop culture, especially television, dealt with the family, and specifically the kind of dominant model for family in the United States, which was, again, a married male and female couple with living with their own their underage, in other words, non-adult biological children. That was kind of the conventional model for what families looked like on television, what families sometimes looked like in film. And the Simpsons were very deliberately kind of concocted to be a send up of that. They are sort of a spoof of the nuclear family, and that is part of the reason, of course, why Homer works in a nuclear power plant. They're just kind of running the joke into the ground, if you will. But if you think about this structure, this would be maybe how most people would sort of diagram their family. They would put down the people who occupy the various positions. The thing is, when a sociologist looks at a family, they don't look at the people who occupy the positions, they look at the positions. They would say, for example, in this particular structure, in this informal group, what are the statuses that Homer occupies? And that would be husband and father, right? Uh, we would look at Marge and say, what defines Marge relationally to the rest of this structure? And she's a wife and a mother. Bart, of course, is a son and a brother. Lisa is a daughter and a sister, as is Maggie, right? And we would start to look at the relationships within this structure in that relational sense, right? When is Lisa a daughter? Well, Lisa is a daughter when she's interacting with either Homer or Marge. Lisa's behavior toward Maggie or Bart is not the behavior of a daughter, it's going to be the behavior of a sister, right? So we think of the statuses and we think of the roles. Just to make a call back to the last session, father and mother, husband and wife, those are achieved statuses. Daughter and sister and son and brother, those are ascribed statuses, right? So you can see those statuses kind of in terms of whether they're ascriptive or achieved as well. Now, Homer is going to behave as a husband only in interaction with Marge, right? It would be inappropriate for him to behave as a husband toward anyone else in the family. So his status is going to be a function of the various contexts in which he finds himself, right? Where he is, when he's there, who he's with. So you look at the way that the day unfolds inside the Simpsons household, and you would see a set of behaviors that are largely predictable, right? He's going to be doing father things when he's with his kids. He's going to be doing husband things when he's with his wife. And father things and husband things, right? The role of father or the role behaviors that attach to the status of father and the role behaviors that attach to husband, all right, the status of husband, those are socially defined. He has some latitude, he has some leeway to depart from those things to a certain degree, but only within limits, right? That we are kind of in effect we're kind of chained to, or we're kind of locked into some parameters, some boundaries in either direction with regard to how strictly we conform to these roles. And a lot of humor is made of the fact that Homer is kind of constantly on the edge of what's acceptable when it comes to behaviors as both a father and a husband. Marge is much more conventional and becomes kind of the anchor that holds the family together. Now, I want to point out one other thing that's kind of interesting about the way that sociology would look at this structure, right? We would not, as I said, be particularly concerned with Homer or Marge or Maggie or Lisa or Bart, but rather the father or the mother or the husband or the wife or the daughter or the sister. But those statuses themselves are specific patterns that reflect the intersection of another status. So we might ask ourselves, what makes Homer a father? Well, he has kids, but Marge has kids. Why isn't she a father? Well, because she's a woman, right? And now we see that father and mother are gendered ways of doing a particular status. Husband and wife are gendered ways of doing a particular status. So we might look at parents and spouse and say, okay, so Marge is a parent, but because she's also female, her expectations are going to look different than what Homer's expectations are going to look like. Just like with Bart and Lisa and Maggie, right? We've got children and we have siblings, and daughter is a gendered way of doing child, and son is a gendered way of doing child. So when sociologists look at groups, they almost completely skip any kind of focus or any kind of attention to the specific individuals who occupy the positions, because the vast majority of the explanation for behaviors that we're going to observe in something like a family are going to flow from the statuses that these people occupy and the role expectations that accompany them. Right? That's going to provide a much more useful set of insights into how the people in this particular structure are behaving. All right. So the next largest structure, when we move away from groups, is an organization. And an organization is it's larger, right? So it's a large, complex network of positions. It's created for a specific purpose. It's characterized by what we call a division of labor. Structurally speaking, you can think about an organization as a collection of statuses and groups, right? But again, organized around specific goals and tasks. The relationships inside the organization itself are instrumental in nature, and the organizations are characterized by something we call formal rationality. Now, we mentioned formal rationality once before when we were talking about Max Weber and his approach to making sense of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the way that people think, right? So formal rationality, again, is a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Organizations tend to be highly rational, and the relationships in those organizations are position to position rather than person to person. So if we look at Harper College, which is where we would find Sociology 101, we see that there are lots of other groups within Harper College, right? There's the admissions office, there's financial aid, there's the bookstore, there's the Access and Disability Services office, right? And if you look inside each of those groups, you're going to find relationally defined statuses. So that goes back to this whole nested nature of this model, right? So when we look back into smaller and smaller structures that are contained within these larger structures, like an organization, we will find, again, a collection of related statuses, but also the groups that represent the sort of specific goals and tasks, right? We have an admissions office and we have a bookstore, and they do two very different things, both of which are really important to facilitate the ability of students to pass through Harper College and receive an education and be credentialed in the process. So these structures that we see kind of ultimately reflect that. Now, Harper College itself as an organization is embedded within an even larger structure, which we call an institution. Now, before I proceed to institutions, I want to make a note about language here. There are people, and I've often done this myself as well, who will refer to Harper College as an institution of higher learning. And that's perfectly all right, but when sociologists use the word institution, they have a very specific thing in mind. Organizations are not institutions. Organizations are part of institutions. An institution is really, really large. These are the largest structures that exist in society. The only thing larger than an institution within a society is the society itself. So when we look at, I have a little division of labor thing here. When we look at institutions, we see, again, that they are common across all societies. These are ideas and practices about the way a society is going to address a really fundamental or important social need. And in that case, we're going to find them across all societies because all societies have the same broad shared set of social needs. For example, every society needs to transfer skills and knowledge from one generation to the next. That's what we call education. Large-scale organizations that are tasked with the intergenerational transfer of skills and knowledge, that is the institutional space within a society that we call education. Now, what an institution looks like in a given society is going to depend on a lot of things specific to that society, including its size, its level of technological development, the diversity or the homogeneity of its population, right? All of those kinds of things factor in. So if we were to go back to hunting and gathering societies and we were to look at education, it would consist of sort of oral and experiential learning, right? We tell people what to eat, we show people how to hunt, right? Because people who know how to do those things need to share that information with those who don't, so that the next generation doesn't have to discover all of that all over again. And we're free to sort of continue to build on prior knowledge, and in that way we can kind of advance as a society. So when we think about institutions, right, think about the basic social need, because if you're thinking about the specific forms it takes, it's going to be sometimes hard for you to recognize an institution when you find one that doesn't look like the institution as it exists in your society. Whether we're talking about economy or education or governance or science, family, mass media, medicine, religion, all of those things represent basic social needs across all societies, and across all societies in time. So we can see these institutions cropping up in other places around the world, but we also see them cropping up at various points in time. And they're just going to look a little bit different. So in the United States, right, education consists of formal education with credentialing and classes and tuition and all of those other things. But it also consists of things like unions and departments of education or professional associations, even textbook publishers, right? These are all people who participate in facilitating that intergenerational transfer of skills and knowledge. And that's something that is important to keep in mind and to remember when we're thinking about things at this level of social organization. So here again, just to sum up, here's the nested model again, and we're going to talk about processes next time. So I want to kind of preview that a little bit. When we talk about social processes, we're talking about the interactional connections. That's the stuff on the diagram here that's represented by the arrows. So the interactional connections that exist between individuals in society and the rest of society. And there are 4 of them. We have socialization, social control, deviance, and collective action. And we're going to walk through all of these things at the end of the semester. So we're going to dive in deep and sort of unpack these 4 processes when we get to chapter 4 and outline 4. But for now, we'll just kind of give an introduction and talk briefly and broadly about them in the next lecture. So until then, take care.